So the fourth part of matrices is about row operations. And row operations are like normal operations in algebra. When we say operations, we just mean procedures. The most common ones are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And so we have the same sort of idea when we go into our matrices. And obviously, as we've seen, some of these properties that are similar in algebra and our normal numbers are not always necessarily true in matrices. Like, for example, we multiplied, and with normal multiplication, order doesn't matter. You can rearrange your numbers however you wish. Unfortunately, when it comes to matrices, though, that is not true. When you multiply, order does matter very much. And so there are some basic row operations that we can do within the matrices. And the first one is our row switching. And this just means we are rearranging the matrix. And obviously you have to understand, like, this may seem very useless and pointless, but the purpose of this is for some higher level math, which I'm not going to require us to get into, but it is sort of good to know the foundation and the basics of this in case you were to take, I don't know, a linear algebra class one day. You would have the basics you would need in order to be successful in that class. So the first thing you have to understand is how to row switch, and usually this is by giving arrows. Sometimes in like linear algebra books, sometimes they'll represent it by saying take row 1 and switch it with row 3. Sometimes they'll say it like that, but in this particular case, we are just going to say it is going to be represented by arrows. So in this particular case, I have my top line, my top row, and it tells me to move it to the very bottom. And so I would write 0, 0, 1, 3 at the bottom. The second row is telling me to go to the very top, so I will write that at the very top. And then finally, my last row tells me to go into the middle now. And so this becomes my matrix. Okay, so it's very easy, very straightforward. There's nothing difficult about this. It's just making sure that you copy down the numbers correctly. And I would say that's probably the biggest issue that I've seen over the years. So the second operation that we can do is row multiplication, and this is typically represented by our little arrow right here. As you can see, that arrow tells us that we need to take row 1, that's r sub 1, row 1, we need to take that and multiply it by a -1. And we can see that it sort of even visually shows us which row we're multiplying by -1 because it's at the top. It's not at the bottom, it's at the top. But even if it were in the middle, we could know that we would be multiplying the middle by, or the top row, row 1, by -1. So I'm going to multiply all of these by -1. Think about it like the distributive property. And so it's going to be 1, 0, 0, and then -3. And then all the other numbers are just going to be carried down below, and that would be our answer. So even if we're multiplying by this, a common question is, can you divide? Well, not necessarily. You can't really divide with matrices, and so but we could multiply by it inverse. So in this particular case, we are multiplying by a -1/3. It has no bearing if it's negative or positive, it's just whatever. But this time we are, quote unquote, if you will, dividing. We're not really, we're just multiplying by -1/3. So I'm going to take that -1/3, I'm going to distribute it to everything, so that'll give me 0, 0, 2/3, and -4/3. I'll carry all of my other numbers, and then I will not really box in my answer, but I will put my brackets around my matrix so that I know I am done. And so this becomes my answer. So the thing about row multiplication is that we could put two row multiplications on the same matrix. And so here we have the same problem we had before, but now we are working with just the top and the bottom, and we are ignoring completely the middle, and the process is still the same. So I would take that -1 and I would distribute it, and then I would multiply it to get my top row. Then I would do the same process again for the other row multiplication, and then the piece that I didn't touch, I would just carry over. All right, and this would be our answer. So then the third and final operation or row operation that we have is row addition. And so you have to be careful about a couple of things here. Common mistakes are people know to add the rows, that's not an issue, but they don't know where to put it. So this one says to add row 1 and row 2. So I'm just going to circle the values that I need to end up adding. And so if I add it up, that'll give me 0, 1, 8, and -2. And so here's where the question that I commonly see is they say, okay, well, I know how to do that. Does it replace row 1 or does it replace row 2? And so that is a really good question. You have to look at where the arrow is pointing. If the arrow is at the middle, well, then you need to put it in the middle row. If the arrow is at the top, you would replace the top. And in this particular case, it's in the middle, so that's why I put it in the middle here. So even though I used row 1 in order to figure out my row addition, I don't actually need to change anything about it, so I'm going to carry it over. All right, and then I didn't do anything with row 3, so I'm going to carry that down as well. And so this becomes my answer. So again, notice how our arrow is showing us which row we're going to replace, and how even though we used row 1 to get our addition, we did not replace row 1 because the arrow told us to replace row 2. So I'm not going to do both of these examples. I'm only going to do one from each section. But example 1 just says complete the following operations, and we don't really see any operations besides rearranging. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to rearrange this, and we're going to have the top row is going to come down, the second row is going to come around, the third row is going to stay at the third row, and then finally we're going to have our bottom row become the top row. And so I color coordinated everything so you could see exactly where everything was going, but this is just simply moving your rows up or down, and so this would be our answer. Example 2, we have the same thing happening again, but we can see that they want us to take row 1 and multiply it by -1 and row 2 by -2. So I'm going to go ahead and take that -1, distribute it, and get those values, and then I'll do the same thing again with -2 and get those values. Anything I did not touch, I'll carry over, and that'll be our final answer. All right, I'll let you guys do the other one on your own, but as you can see, this is a very straightforward concept. So then example 3, this is our row operation. This is the only one that I would definitely caution you and make sure you take your time with. So this one we have to add row 2 and row 3. So I'm going to circle row 2 and row 3. And then I'm going to add that up. That'll give me 4 and 9. And I'm going to put it next to wherever the arrow is. And so that's why you can see the 4 and the 9 are even with my arrow. And anything that I did not touch, I'm going to carry over. So that's the 1 and 3. And then because my arrow is on row 3, I know that row 2 is also something I didn't touch. So I can carry over the 2, 4, and then row 1, 1, and 3. And so this is our final answer. So the next problem, example 4, is when we are looking at, when we have a combination of a couple of items. So because the first example says to do two things, it says we need to multiply and we need to add. We have a row multiplication and addition. And so I'm going to take this piece by piece. I'm going to work, you can think about it like PEMDAS, where we work with any multiplication and division first, and then we go to addition and subtraction. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply my row 1 by 2. That'll give me 2, 4, and 2. I'll carry down the pieces I didn't use, and I'll just sort of bracket that so I know that that first step is sort of done. At this point, I know I need to add row 1 and row 2 after I multiplied by 2. So I'm going to now add these up, and I'm going to get, and I actually am moving that arrow down because I know I need to replace row 2. So I should get 0, 4 plus 3 is 7, and then 2 plus 5 is also 7. Okay, and so remember that when we're doing this, this is only replacing row 2. So I'm going to take my row 1 from the beginning, and this becomes my answer. Okay, so please, that is, again, this is where a lot of people, they make mistakes because they don't understand, if you will, or they're not used to this process. But all of the work right here that we did is for the second row. And yes, we showed it on the first row to sort of help us, but it was essentially just to help us get our final answer. And our final answer doesn't have any operations for row 1, so our final answer should have a completely untouched row 1 as the answer, which is why I have that 1, 2, 1. So let me do one more example just to make sure that we have this solidified. So the second example says, okay, here's your new one. Go ahead and take your row 2 and multiply by -2. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to get 0, -2, and -2. I have my 1, 2, 1 that's untouched as of yet. And then the next step says I need to add these up and replace row 1. So I'm going to, that was -2r. All right, so this is going to give me 1, 0, and then -1. So again, the original question right here was do these steps and replace row 1. But notice there is no arrow or row operations for row 2. So therefore our final answer should have the untouched row 2 in our final answer, and that is how you do that. So if you have any questions, make sure you ask me or text me on Teams or email, and I will gladly help you.